Welcome everyone to Monday Match Analysis. I'm Gill Gross, and it is time for the 2025 ATP Top 10 prediction. What will the top 10 look like at the end of next year? That is the task that I put myself through and agonize over every year right around this time. And I mean it. I agonize over it because it always feels really, really hard. And the decisions I have to make sometimes, they're scary decisions. Like, I am fully aware that some of these calls I make, I might be looking back at it next year and I'm just going to feel like an idiot. And that's how it is every single year. Happy holidays, everybody. Hope it is a good one. Let's start by looking at last year. I always start with that. So how wrong was Gill? This was my top 10 prediction. And you can see in parentheses next to the names, it's the movement that I predicted. So Djokovic, I had, after his 3 major season, holding on to the fort and finishing number 1. I had Alcaraz 2, Sinner 3, Medvedev 4, Rune 5, which was only up 3 spots. He finished 2 years ago at number 8. I had him moving up 3 spots to 5. Zverev at 6, up 1 spot. Rublev at 7, down 2 spots. Tsitsipas at 8, down 2 spots. Hurkacz at number 1, down 1 spot. And Nadal, who did not have a healthy or active 2024, as I thought he may, I predicted him to finish at number 10. Actual top 10, you can see that on the right of your screen on YouTube. So let's just go over what the actual top 10 is right now in terms of how well I did. So Sinner is number 1, missed that. I'll just say Sinner's number 1, 2 spots higher than what I had. Zverev's number 2, 4 spots higher than what I had. Alcaraz is number 3, 1 spot lower. Fritz is number 4, didn't have him in the top 10. Medvedev's number 5, 1 spot lower than what I had. Ruud is in the 6th. I didn't have him in the top 10. Djokovic is 7. That is 6 spots lower than I predicted. Rublev is 8, 1 spot lower. Minaur is 9. I didn't have him in. And Dimitrov is 10. I didn't have him in either. So, look, I'm always fearful, as I said, that I'm just going to totally make a fool of myself in this activity. I feel like the first 2 years I did it, so 2022 and 2023, at the end of the year, I was like, oh, wow, I did pretty well. This year, there were many that I got close, but I don't know. There were 4 guys in the top 10 who I didn't have in the top 10. I feel like that's pretty bad on my part. So I feel like this wasn't a great year for my top 10 predictions. Hopefully we get a rebound. Let me take you now through what the process was like for me, because this is always informative. I always kind of learn something about what the landscape looks like when I put myself through this. Like last year, I looked at the top 10 and it seemed very solid to me. I said this last year. Everyone in the top 10 had finished top 10 at least 2 years in a row, other than Jannik Sinner, who was young and rising, and Holger Rune, who was young and at the time, in theory, rising. So it was just hard to imagine a lot of people leaving the top 10, entering the top 10, and my predictions were very stagnant, but it was a more unpredictable year. Like, it didn't play out that way, right? Rune's direction, Tsitsipas's direction, falling out for the first time in 5 years. Although I was directionally correct on Tsitsipas, I had him moving down. I didn't have him moving as far down as he would end up. Hurkacz got hurt, had a bad second half, didn't have the 1,000 run, so he was also out after a couple of top 10 seasons for Hurkacz. So if I'm taking lessons from last year, it's just the tour can be volatile, even if it doesn't look like it should be or that it's going to be based on age. And, don't let last year dictate too much, because, things are normally not steady. It's just not how things go. Another thing that I was reflecting on, I look at a guy like Fritz and Minaur, and they're two guys who theoretically were surprising in the sense that I think a lot of people, myself to an extent, they put certain limitations on those guys based on their natural gift, based on natural ability. For de Minaur, it might be strength and power, soft hitter of the tennis ball, didn't have a big serve. There was some technical stuff there. And then Fritz, it's the movement, right? And you just say, okay, he's just not a good enough natural athlete. The movement isn't there. So sure, you might see him at 8 in the world or 9 in the world or 10 in the world, but you feel like maybe he won't be able to rise much higher. Okay, why were we wrong on that? How come de Minaur and Fritz were able to do what they did? And I just go to their character. Those are two guys who are maniacal competitors and workers. That's what we know about de Minaur and Fritz. Everyone who knows them, everyone who's around them, de Minaur might wear it on his sleeve a little bit more than Taylor, but I think if you dig deeper, like Taylor is made of that, is cut from that same cloth. They are crazy people in terms of how bad they want it and how hard they work. And that's the common thread with those guys. So it's something I kept in the back of my mind when I was doing my predictions this year. What do I think of the mental makeup? And allowed that to guide me a little bit more than usual. Because there were definitely question marks mentally with Tsitsipas and Rune at the time. I said it at the time, but I kind of looked past it. I won't look past it as easily this year. Also, health is going to play a significant factor, as always, right? There's always at least one or two guys at the end of the year where you look at and you say, okay, might have gotten that prediction wrong. Injury was at the core of it. But I try to factor in injury proneness. The other thing that I noticed here, the difference between 5 in the world and 15 in the world feels tiny. I remember many years covering this sport where I thought there was clearly a tier 1 with a couple guys, 2 to 4 guys, a tier 2 with another maybe 3-4 guys, a tier 3 with another maybe 5 guys. That's not how it looks right now. Tier 3 then feels enormous to me. It feels 15 players deep. And if I look at the rankings right now, and I could throw out a ton of matchups for you, I can throw out Casper Ruud, 6 in the world, against Lorenzo Musetti, 17 in the world. I can give you Rublev, 8 in the world, versus Fils, 20 in the world, or Hurkacz, 16, or Draper, 15. I just think the divide between 5 and about 18 is a lot smaller than it usually is, which is really exciting. I don't really have a point to make. I just think that's great and very exciting. Okay, one thing before I get started. Remember, everybody, points to defend does not matter. It does not matter. So every year there are people in the comments like, oh boy, like Sinner has a lot of points to defend. Doesn't matter. We're talking about the year-end ranking, right? So Sinner's lead over Alcaraz doesn't matter because every single point that Sinner has right now will be erased by the end of next year. It won't exist. So there's no like Sinner has a lead. That doesn't exist. Now you can look at seeding. Like if a player missed the first half and all of their points are second half, the one thing you could say is if they have a good first half, their ranking is going to be really high and they might get good seeding. So there's that small technicality. But other than that, do not think about last year because it does not matter. All right? Let's get into the honorable mentions. These are the players that I didn't put into the top 10. I will run through some of them pretty quickly, and then as we get closer to the top 10, I might go into more depth. João Fonseca. I wanted to address him. And first of all, okay, the players who I'm about to rattle off are not really players who I considered putting in the top 10, but they're players who I think should be mentioned. All right? So let's start with Fonseca. Let's work under the assumption that he is on the Sinner-Alcaraz path, which is an assumption that I'm happy to go with. Well, Sinner broke through at the challenger level in 2019. In 2020, he finished 37th in the world. Alcaraz broke through at the challenger level in 2020. The next year, 2021, first year on tour, he finished 32nd in the world. There were some frozen points, some pandemic weirdness with 2020 and 2021, sure. But my point is, it's too early for Fonseca. It almost always takes a year. Have some patience here. It's too early. Ben Shelton, another honorable mention. I need to see more progress in the return game before I can consider him for the top 10. He was 77th among qualified players in break rate last year. 77th. The worst serve breaker in the top 10 was Taylor Fritz, who was 43rd. So there is a world of difference between the worst return, breaker of serve guy in the top 10 statistically and Shelton. A world of difference there. He's got to make up so much ground. And look, he's not Isner, he's not Raonic, he's not Pecci Pericard, he's not even Hurkacz. He's not that level of server where we can ignore the return game and start to think about Shelton as a top 10 player at this time. I just don't see it at the moment. Lorenzo Musetti, awesome 2024 season. The mental concerns are gone. He was more focused. He was more motivated and determined. Stylistically, in terms of his attributes and how he's built as a player, I still think he fights a bit of an uphill battle. The serve and the return need to keep getting better so he can put himself in better positions more consistently. He's still young. I think he's going to be a top 10 player at some point, but not yet. And I'll also say the hard court abundance, he's one of these guys that really hurts him. His best surfaces are clay and grass, but if you look at the calendar breakdown in terms of the rankings points especially, being a guy who's best on the natural surfaces doesn't necessarily make anything easier. Nick Kyrgios, I'm going to give him a mention. I'll tell you why. Some of you might not even think he's worthy of a mention because he's been out of the picture. I'll tell you why he's worthy of a mention. The last year he was healthy, he was he was a top 10 player in terms of level in 2022. Look at the stats. He didn't play a ton, and that hurt him, and he turned it on in the second half, and he didn't quite get into the top 10, but if you look at how he played against top competition, how he played some of the big events, if you look at his win percentage, he's a top 10 player easily. That was the last time he's healthy. So he's planning to come back in 2024. I think he's at least worth considering in this conversation. Now, I'm not putting him in the top 10 because right now, 2022 is an outlier in his career. And he needs to prove that the fitness and the mental, both which were by far the best we had ever seen in 2022, he needs to show that those 6 months can be replicated. He hasn't shown that. Plus, we need to see if the forehand is the same post-wrist surgery, because that can be tricky. Fingers crossed that the right wrist is okay and he doesn't kind of fall down the path of some of the bad examples, like mainly Dominic Thiem. So Kyrgios, not putting him in the top 10. Okay, next. These are the guys who I considered more strongly. This next group, these are guys who I had to have a good think about. Stefanos Tsitsipas. Let's start with him. This is in no particular order, by the way, except for one guy. I'll tell you who my world number 11 is. I'll tell you. But other than that, this is in no particular order. Let's talk about Tsitsipas. So, in theory, parting with his father could signal a bounce-back year for a guy who is an established top 5 talent and just needed confidence and structure and motivation and refocusing. In my opinion, just the mental has gone off the rails. And by the way, I said it before this year. His 2023 didn't look right mentally to me. His 2024 certainly didn't look right mentally to me. And you would think maybe, okay, fresh new start, Apostolos is out as the head coach. That's cool. Here's my thing, though. So he brings in the Greek Davis Cup captain to coach him on an interim basis. His name's Dimitris Hatzinikolo. And he says, okay, he's just my coach while I look for a real coach. Now, after saying it's temporary, it appears that still Hatzinikolo is the coach. And I'm concerned about that. Like that doesn't, and that's not a Hatzinikolo problem, okay? No shade to him. I don't know Hatzinikolo. I know nothing about him. He could be a tennis genius. He could be. And I don't think you need to be a big name who was a great player in order to be a phenomenal coach. I don't feel that way at all. But in terms of what I think Tsitsipas needs, structure, certainty, someone who can wield enough power to break through the family influence, which is a strong influence, and I don't think it's just going to go away now that Apostolos isn't in the box, okay? We still have FaceTime. I'm pretty sure Apostolos is still going to have some influence here. And by the way, at the U.S. Open, when Apostolos wasn't even there, Tsitsipas's mother, Julia, seemed to also be pretty hands-on in the coaching from the box. So I just think you need someone who brings a lot of authority to the table. I just wish someone was coming in with a ton of credibility so that the confusion and the too many voices situation could be fixed once and for all. I'm not convinced that Hatzinikolo is that guy. Look, this is not an easy situation to coach in. Mark Philippoussis couldn't even do it. Mark Philippoussis came in and his voice couldn't quite break through in that situation. So I'm just not sure that Tsitsipas has found his coach. And I would love to predict a bounce back year for Tsitsipas, but that's not going to do it. There's probably an alternate universe where he makes a really great hire who I like, and maybe I do pick him in the top 10. All right, Arthur Fils. Don't have him in, although I considered it. He's still 20 years old. I think it's early. Now, physically, he's ready. Last year, he showed me he's a great competitor. His serve got way better, but I'm still looking for a little bit more polish in the shot selection, in the return of serve, and in the overall consistency, which did get better in the second half of last year. I just need to maybe see it for a longer period of time because the explosiveness on its own, it won't get him there. I think he needs a little bit more polish. I think it's about 1 year too early for Arthur Fils. Hubert Hurkacz, I have him out. Now, he made some huge coaching moves. Craig Boynton, who was coaching him for a long time, and he's one of the best in the business, he's out. Ivan Lendl and Nicolas Massou are going to tag team it. Two guys with incredible resumes, respectively themselves. Very different resumes, but both very good resumes. So it's interesting with Hurkacz, but I just don't think his ground strokes and his movement stack up with the best. And versus top 10 competition in the last 2 years, his record is 3-12. And it's always very hard for me to pick a guy to be top 10 when he's not beating top 10 players. He's very rarely beating top 10 players. That's hard for me. I like guys who are winning big matches against top players if I can find those guys. Hurkacz is not one of them right now. All right, I've got Grigor Dimitrov out. He's been awesome the last 2 years because in 2023, he really did play a top 10 level. His ranking didn't reflect that because he got a lot of bad draw luck. And then last year, it was great to see his ranking ends up reflecting that. And it was great tennis for him. Now 2 years in a row where the backhand is more consistent, he's more clear-headed and offensive with his serve and his forehand. And I love what he's found here, and I love what he's doing here. But he's the old guy in the mix at 33 years old. And there is a messy injury history with Dimitrov. I really want him to put it together at a slam, but I just can't bank on the health thing continuing to be as good as it's been the last couple of years. It hasn't been flawless, there, especially at the slams. There have been a lot of issues at majors health-wise. But yeah, I'm looking at the age thing. I think it might have been a little 2-year resurgence window, and I think that time might be running out for Dimitrov. Berrettini, I don't have in. Now, look, there are a lot of terrific numbers that suggests that he got back to a top 10 level last year. In fact, win percentage-wise, he ended up 5th. His strengths are still there, just watching him. Great serve, great forehand, good touch and feel, very focused mentally, very clutch. He's never doubts himself in big moments. He knows exactly how he needs to play. So all that stuff is good. But from what I saw, his weaknesses are also unchanged. It's the same. The backhand to me just looks the same. The movement looks the same. So, you can take that as a positive and a negative. But to me, it just looks like the same old Berrettini. And look, for a while, that Berrettini was a top 10 player. But it was, he had an 8 in the world, a 10 in the world, a 7 in the world. So it was always kind of back end of the top 10. So it was never like emphatic. And he's on a pretty brutal stretch against top 10 competition as well. Worse than Hurkacz. Berrettini is 3-17 since the start of 2021 against top 10 players. And for what it's worth, all 3 wins are at the ATP Cup and the United Cup. Again, for what it's worth. I mean, it's just kind of strange that they all came bunched into that particular event. It's been stop-start for him with the injuries. That's probably part of the reason why he hasn't been able to make massive gains in his game or reinvent himself in any way. But I think against top players, they're going to expose the movement. They are going to find the backhand from the back of the court in a multitude of ways. So that, along with the fact that you still have to factor in the risk of injury. His last full season was 2021. You got to factor that in. I don't have him in the top 10. Tommy Paul I left out. I feel like he's hit a bit of a technical wall. I love how he's playing tactically. I think, he and Brad Stein have made some great adjustments there. I love how strong he's gotten physically. I think he's a very gifted athlete, and now he's a durable one as well, which wasn't always the case. He had a lot of arm issues and shoulder issues especially. And I think he's a very focused match player now. That didn't used to be the case. So we've seen the fruits of Tommy Paul's improvements. He's now knocking on the door of the top 10. But the reason why I think he hasn't gone further is because of the serve being pretty average and the forehand being pretty average. And I just think those things have to get better. 27 years old, I just don't really bank on just those things technically leveling up. I'm not banking on that. And that's why I'm leaving Paul out. But at some point, he's going to touch the top 10 at the very least. There's no way. I don't think there's much of a chance that when Paul retires, his career high is outside of the top 10. But I don't think he'll finish there this year. Okay, now we're going to go to the player who I had the most trouble leaving out. And I'm scared. So you could call him my world number 11. You could call him that. He's my next out. It didn't feel good to leave him out. I left him out last year and I was wrong. It's Casper Ruud. Let me just say first, I love his game. I love it. He's got an elite forehand. He's a great mover. He's got a consistent backhand that he protects now much better than he used to. It's not really his game. It's the inconsistency of the results, which I think come from upstairs in the head. And what we've seen the last 2 years is there have been patches of play where Ruud is great, but it's not the majority. It's not most of the season. And last year, look, he was a savage in February on the hard court and throughout clay. He was awesome. He maximized that period on the calendar. And then he totally fell off a cliff. And it's 2 second halves in a row that have been ugly. And his hard court numbers, if you look at his hard court numbers in 2021 and 2022, they were better those 2 years than they've been in both 2023 and 2024. So we've seen hard court regression, and we've just seen these ups and downs. And as great as he is on clay, I just think it's a really hard formula to replicate and expect to be top 10 year after year after year. Sometimes it's going to happen, but if you only play well for 2-3 months out of the year, I just think it's hard to be consistently top 10. And now we've seen that 2 years in a row. And Look, what's the why of this all? I don't know. He just seems really prone to burnout. He seems really prone to loss of confidence, especially when he's not into the conditions, like when he just feels like, oh, this doesn't suit me. And the other thing, the other theory I have is there aren't really a ton of things that he can turn to and lean on if he's not feeling great about his forehand. And these things aren't necessarily weaknesses, but they're also not strengths. I don't feel like he can lean on the backhand. I don't think he can lean on the serve. I don't think he can lean on his defense. He's tried that. It has not worked. I don't think he can lean on his craftiness offensively. So it's kind of forehand or bust. And maybe that also contributes to why sometimes Ruud can just go away and become a non-factor. And that's why I left him out. It wasn't easy to do because I love his game. And look, if you told me Ruud puts it together and finishes number 4 in the world next year, I wouldn't actually call you crazy, because I think the very best version of Ruud consistently, I think the raw ingredients are there. Okay. We have arrived to the top 10. We've done it. We've made it. Here we go. At number 10, I've got Holger Rune. Now, most people who have watched Holger the last 2 years have noted that he looks confused. He looks unsure of himself. I don't mean facially. I don't mean he's got a puzzled look on his face. I mean in terms of the decisions he's making on the court. Because one match they can be one thing, the other match they can be the other. Point to point, it might change. And it's like, man, what's this guy's identity? Well, as a result of Rune being very unsure and all over the place, I'm unsure. I'm watching him and I'm like, who is this? I don't know what to make of this. But there's 2 factors here that give me enough faith to at least put him in the top 10. One, this is a profile that you should almost have blind faith in. He is 21 years old, and he's already finished top 15 3 times, top 10 once. 21. So a 21-year-old, like if you just don't even look at who it is. Don't look at the name. Just look at the profile. That is a clear, that's a top 10 guy who's just looking to kind of figure it out, looking for things to click into place as a young player. And I just feel like in a way you should almost have blind faith in a dude whose floor as a young player, when he looks totally disorganized, is still top 15. It's like, yeah, he should be top 10 because he should be improving. He should be figuring some things out and learning. And that also comes down to his coaching team, which has been a bit of a carousel, which hasn't helped him, I don't think. There hasn't been a lot of stability. This is the opposite Tsitsipas situation. I said if Tsitsipas hired someone I really liked, I might predict him in the top 10. If Rune hired anybody else, I might have him outside of the top 10. But he's got the guy who I think should be the guy, which is Lars Christensen, which is a proven formula. Lars is the guy who developed Rune as a child and took him all the way to the top 10. This works. They understand each other. That's the guy I want to see in Holger's box. It's proven. And I feel good about it. Looking forward to seeing what he brings in 2025. It continues to be fascinating. Before we get to number 9, I just want to remind everybody that it's easier than ever to consume Monday Match Analysis in 2025. We are now on Facebook. We just launched a new YouTube channel just for shorts. And for the first time in 2025, we'll have exclusive short form content on that channel, as well as on Instagram and TikTok only, right? So it's not just clips from the podcast that you may have already seen. It's different, separate content on those platforms. If any of those things interest you, please give me a follow. Links are in the description. Number 9, Daniil Medvedev. Yeah, it's low. It's lower than he's been in a long time. You've got to go back to 2018 since Medvedev missed the year-end championships in Turin, which is what technically I have here. Unless you say that you're predicting Djokovic doesn't play, which I'm kind of predicting. But, that's neither here nor there. All right, Daniil, let me start with the positive. He is still the hardest guy in the world to serve against because you know it's coming back unless you hit an absolutely exceptional serve. He is still up there with the best in consistency and defense. Now we go to the negative. I was looking at my notes from last year, doing this very thing, predicting the top 10 for 2024. And I wrote, quote, strange pattern to watch for. Medvedev's serve in decline. Lowest ace rate since 2018 last year and highest double fault rate. So I wrote that at the beginning of last season. Well, this year, ace rate was even lower. Double fault rate was essentially the same, 0.1 higher. Hold percentage fell big time. So this serve thing for Medvedev, this isn't just an injury blip, I don't think. I don't think it's just like, yeah, Medvedev had a shoulder injury in the middle of the year and that's why his serve has gone down. No, like this is a longer term trend. And at this point, I just think physically the shoulder, and we've seen this before with certain players, like we saw it with Andy Roddick towards the end of his career. And by the way, Andy wasn't that old when this happened. Like his shoulder just started to kind of go on him. There's also an age thing here, okay? He's going to turn 29 in February. And that used to be the decline zone for tennis players. It used to be, okay, you're 29, you're old. That has changed. Don't get me wrong. But there is no precedent for Medvedev, a 6'6" guy who makes his money by scrambling point in and point out. Like we have never seen that play out. We've seen in other sports where like 6'6" guys usually are a little more injury prone, don't have the same longevity. And Medvedev plays as physical a style as anybody. I don't think it's crazy to think that his body might start giving him issues at some point. And the adaptation is what you would normally turn to. That's what, like, Grigor Dimitrov has done. That's what everyone in the big three did to achieve the tremendous longevity that they did. That just doesn't seem like it's in the cards for Medvedev. He's trying. Like, we see times where he's trying to hit bigger from the back of the court, or he's going bigger on second serves and all that. And he just loses what makes him great in the first place. It looked really good at the Australian Open last year. And I was like, oh my God, this could be a thing. This could work. It did for a second, but looking at the whole body of work from last year, no, like I don't think it's there. I don't think he's going to be a guy who adapts that way. So that's why I have Medvedev taking a step back here and finishing number 9. That was also a hard one for me. Not easy for me to make that prediction. Number 8, I've got Jack Draper. As you saw, I think a lot of the young guys are going to get boxed out next year. Shelton, Fils, Fonseca, if you want to throw him in there. Not Draper. I don't think Draper's going to get boxed out. The body is ready. The ideal play style is dialed in. I think he'll find himself in a lot of big matches next year. And that's why I have him at number 8, because I think he's going to be a lot more consistent. I think he's going to take care of business against lower tier competition on a much more regular basis. That said, I think this is going to be the year of losing big matches for Draper. The Sinner U.S. Open semifinal was an example. He's got a long way to go in terms of nerve management. I think that's going to be the big thing that Draper is going to be held back by this year. Especially because this is his first year of big expectation. It's his first year starting as British number 1 in a particularly difficult media market. That stuff isn't easy to handle or deal with for anybody. He'll get used to it. He'll get better at it, but it is a change for him. That said, I really believe in his skill set. He checks every box, in my view, now that the forehand is more punishing and he isn't letting things get so physical. I don't know what he's not good at. And that's what I want out of a future star in the game. I want to look at every aspect of his game and be able to put a check mark. And I feel like that's the case with Draper. At number 7, I've got Novak Djokovic, which is where he finished last year. Because I think last year is going to end up being a pretty good indication of what and who Djokovic is moving forward. Somebody who, in flashes, is going to be elite. but also somebody who can't or doesn't have interest in maintaining that. Now, first of all, the schedule is a huge question mark, and that is absolutely baked in to where I'm predicting Novak here at 7. I'm assuming he's not going to play in February, probably not going to play in March, probably not going to play after the US Open. So that's going to do a number on his ranking as it did this year. Now, level-wise, it says a lot that Djokovic can basically have 1 foot out the door of the 2024 season and make the Shanghai final. That he can be seemingly the worst version of himself at the Australian Open, just emotionally flat, and still make the semifinal down under. That he can have 75% movement, maybe 80, and still make the Wimbledon final. Like, whoa, that is eye-opening. So the skills take him very, very far. The level is still there. I just have concerns about this idea that he's going to be flipping the on and off switch back and forth constantly. If you look at the calendar and it's like, I'm going to rest here, I'm going to peak here, I'm going to rest here, I'm going to peak here, I'm going to rest here, I'm going to peak here. I think we've seen over the years with aging players, that's not easy to do. And I can't see that working in the sense where sometimes he's going to try to turn it on and it won't be there. I think that happened last year to a certain extent. I think he'll have a few weeks this season where he looks like his best and he can beat anybody, but I think the consistent Djokovic era is probably over. So that's it. Flashes. I think, and by the way, at big tournaments, if you can put together a few flashes, there's a lot of points. Like if Djokovic wins his 25th major, that's a lot of points. He might finish 7 in the world if he doesn't even do much else. That's kind of what I'm looking at with Novak next year. All right. Number 6, Alex de Minaur. He is probably the easiest guy here for people to just knock off. I imagine there's going to be a lot of top 10 predictions out there. I imagine there's going to be a lot of no de Minaur. He's out. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it for these reasons. One, he was going to finish 5th or 6th in the rankings last year without the hip thing at Wimbledon. I feel really strongly about that. You look at where he was, the level he was playing, what he was able to do in the second half, even when he was kind of hobbled and hampered. He was going to be 5th or 6th, so he was up there. And character-wise, I'm sorry, he's just not the kind of guy to go backwards at 25 years old. I just don't see that for him. His work ethic is incredible. His coaching team is stable. He's constantly adding. He's got a nice support system off court. I mean, congrats to him and Katie Boulter just got engaged. That's important for Aussies. Like, I always have a lot of sympathy and respect for Aussies. They are so far away from home, unable to go back home in between tournaments. I mean, like 10 months out of the year, they're away from home. It's not easy. All right? I don't lose sight of that. You have to have a good support system off court, I think, to deal with that. A couple of areas for improvement. I'm interested in the first serve percentage. He obviously tried to beef it up last year, start to serve bigger. He was averaging 122. I always say it's like 4 or 5 miles per hour faster than Medvedev, but first serve percentage, worst in the top 50. Horrid. Curious if he can get that up. I imagine maybe a little bit. Here's a bonus. I'm looking at pictures of him ahead of 2025. He's looking jacked. Like it looks like he added even more weight, more upper body strength. And that's been a piece of the puzzle for him to start hitting bigger and serving bigger and being more offensively threatening. He is continuing to just add weight and add weight and add weight. And this sounds like a joke, right? Like, Gill, really? You're gonna see him sleep with a sleeveless shirt and base your prediction on that? Like, yeah, that kind of sounds like a joke, but I'm also a big proponent of the undersized players to be strong and bulky, like physically. Like David Ferrer is your model here. He's your example, right? He was a top 5 player in the world for 5 years in a row. He was 5'9" and he didn't have a big serve. But one thing I always like to point out about David Ferrer, he was strong as an ox. Like, he was jacked. And that's the only way that, well, first of all, like he had a underratedly big forehand, okay? and he could be strong from defensive positions on both the forehand and the backhand, which was essential. It's important if you're going to be undersized height-wise. And by the way, Minaur is not even that short. He's like 5'11". If you're going to be a little bit undersized height-wise, I want you to be strong physically. And Minaur is going that direction. I've got him number 6. Number 5, Andrey Rublev. It's been a big saga, Rublev. The first 2 years I did this, I picked him to miss the top 10. And he proved me wrong twice in a row. Last year, I had him inside the top 10. I actually had him a little too high. I had him only one spot. I had him at 7. He ended up finishing 8th. So finally, I got Rublev right. Let's go, baby. He's actually had this crazy pattern, 8-5, 8-5, 8. That's been his last 4 years. Sorry, his last 5 years. So, again, is it kind of a meme that I have him at 5th? A little bit. But the fact that he seems to finish 8th in his worst years is telling. And last year was one of those worst years. I mean, I thought he got a little bit fortunate the way things played out at a couple of the big tournaments. Canada, which of course he had a bit of an advantage because he didn't play the Olympics, and he got to really play DC and had a weaker than usual field at Canada because of the circumstance of the calendar. And then in Madrid, he's sick as a dog, and it just feels like it put him into this very odd place mentally, and he was dangerous as heck there as a player. But he only won 62% of his matches last year. That does not cut it. That normally is not a top 10 number. And the Dubai incident seemed to take a big toll. And there were some tough losses at majors. Only one quarterfinal. That came early in Australia. So this was one of those bad years, and it was 8. And that's why I just feel like, okay, there's a lot of reasons to believe Rublev bounces back, kind of goes back to his average. And mentally, you hate how dark he gets. You hate how volatile it is emotionally. But on the other hand, you love his will to compete. You love the fact that he's going to bring it, that he wants it badly. And by the way, that translates to his work ethic, how he trains. And he's been talking about adding some variety in a functioning transitioning game this offseason. We'll see. I to an extent, I'll believe that when I see it. But the fact that the effort is there, that the desire is there, that's going to help him. Even if it gets 5-10% better, something that he can throw in sometimes. I like that. So look, I didn't like his 2024 at all, but I think he's an obvious bounce back candidate. Is that the best argumentation ever? No, but look, it's Rublev. He's been top 8 5 years in a row. I don't think I need to make some elaborate case that he's going to do it again. All right. Number 4, Taylor Fritz. I got to be honest. I didn't really think that I'd predict Fritz to hold the fort down at 4 in the world. But at the end of the day, I don't have any questions about Taylor. I don't have any real concerns about Taylor. I feel like replicating what he did last year, maybe no major final, maybe, but I don't think it's that hard. It didn't feel like he did anything extraordinary for his capabilities. And I just think he can run it back and do it again. Look, coming into last year, my concern was I didn't like what I was seeing at the majors. I just didn't like how his results were taking a downward dip. Totally dispelled that concern this year. Second week at all 4 majors, US Open final. So he's going to come into the slams next year with a level of, I think, confidence and relaxation that could be huge for him. And I think it's going to unlock some slam consistency that just hasn't been here until last year. But look, the skills are so solid. He's got one of the best serves, excellent ball striking both wings. I do think he can take his backhand down the line more often. It's one little tweak I think he can, because you're always looking for where can he get even better, right? I think that's one area. His movement, which people would get hung up on, including myself, I'd get a little bit hung up on, like, okay, is that going to limit his potential? It's good enough to hang. If he's going to be so skillful in so many of those baseline areas, or foundational areas, I should say. His movement is good enough to hang. And mentally, boy, is he consistent. He competes his ass off every week. This was his third straight top 10 year. All right, this wasn't a flash in the pan. We've got a big sample size now that he is a top 10 guy, and I still think he's hungry to do better. One of the things I really like from him, and you talk about mental makeup, and I know I already praised him for it, but when he loses to Jannik Sinner in a U.S. Open final or at the year-end championships in Turin, he's pissed. Like, it hurts him. And that just gives me more confidence that he's going to be able to maintain his best level because he wants more. And he's got some small details technically that really are getting a little bit better. And they're still not great. But the drop shot, the technique is improving. I think the execution is improving. The volleys, there were matches at the U.S. Open where I thought he volleyed great. Not so against Sinner in the final, but it's harder to volley against Sinner. He's Sinner. I think he's getting there in terms of some of that stuff that he's been working on for a really, really long time. So I've always been kind of I actually didn't have him in my top 10 last year, but I've always been sort of a have faith in Fritz kind of guy. And I'm going to back that up now with a very positive prediction for Taylor here. Number 3 is Alexander Zverev. Last year was the best I've seen him serve and the best I've seen him hit his forehand. And those were two things that you really needed to see from Zverev if you felt like he was going to take another jump in his game. He is still a physical force endurance-wise. He is still as consistent as they come from the back. So I think he's a pretty clear tier 2. But I have him behind Sinner and Alcaraz because I just don't back him against Sinner and Alcaraz. He's got wins against them, especially Alcaraz, but I do not back him against those guys. Quite simply, I don't think he matches them for speed and skill. I just don't think he's there. Now, the math, and this is a point I've seen made, I think it's a correct point. The math is in his favor compared to how it used to be in the Big Four era. And in this case, it's 4 because Murray was beating everybody else, okay? Everybody else. Now there's 2, right? So it's that much more likely that there's an injury, there's an upset, and things open up for Zverev and he can win a major, which is ultimately like he can finish number 3 and repeat last year and it'd be a failure for him. It's major or bust, let's be honest, right? The math works for him. I think this is his best chance to win a major of his career. A little bit because of the field, a little bit because of that math thing, more so because of his level and his age. And you know what? I think he actually showed a lot of self-awareness in Turin. And by the way, self-awareness in Zverev, not something I normally put together, but I think he was spot on when he assessed himself in Turin. He said, quote, "I think not backing off and going for your shots at the most important moments. That's maybe where I've struggled at in my career, trusting my shots and going for them when I need to. I personally think that that's something I still need to continue to work on, and hopefully next year is going to be even better." Man, it starts with awareness. Like if you're going to actually overcome that issue, which has been a big issue, it starts with being aware of the issue and acknowledging it. That was interesting for me to see for Zverev. Biggest hazard, though, is, man, he takes another loss in a major final. He's 27 already. This isn't like a Murray-Lendl situation where people say, oh, they lost their first 3-4 slam finals. Man, it's one thing if you're young and you lose a bunch of major finals, especially if you kind of get blown out in them, or at least in some of them. You know, Zverev's been 2-love up. He's been 2-1 up. It's like, how much more can he take before that sort of breaks him? I think that's a hazard for Zverev. All right. Number 2, Jannik Sinner. He is the hunted this year. Maximum amount of pressure. Crazy bar that he's set from last year. It is really difficult for players to ignore the idea that you're defending points or that you're trying to live up to what you achieved last year. It's very difficult. You want to focus. You want to kind of put the blinders on and just focus at the task at hand. But you talk to any player, like that is way easier said than done. So this is a mental challenge for anyone. It's going to be a mental challenge for Sinner. I will say, I love his mental game as much as you could love a mental game. He is never satisfied. He's always looking for more out of himself. He never gets too high. He never gets too low. He's just a worker. He never gets really seemingly distracted by anything. He's beautiful mentally. There's no doubt about it. But there's still some challenges here. Now, many of his losses last year were physical breakdowns. Many came over a time where he was struggling in the background, behind the scenes, with the anti-doping case. So it's almost easier for me to make an argument that Sinner improves next year than he declines compared to 2023. Given his age, looking at how things went last year, where if you disregard improvements, right? Let's say Sinner stays the same as a player, and you just eliminate some of the physical stuff that he had, clay season and grass season, you might be looking at a year that's even better than last year, right? He can also still improve the volleys, especially his aggression and his mentality coming forward. He can still improve there. He's working on the drop shots. On the forehand wing, I think it's gotten pretty good. Maybe he can look to see what he can do on the backhand side with it as well. One thing that he hasn't really shown that is interesting, I think he'll still be trying to build up to this point. He hasn't really shown a ton of endurance at majors. Now, a lot of that is because Australian Open, other than the final, and US Open, he hasn't played long matches. He's crushed everybody. We've seen when he's lost at majors, if you look at his losses over the last 2 years, 5-setters, consistently 5-setters. So that is still sort of hovering in the background, possible area of improvement. Maybe he's a little bit stronger in fifth sets come next year. So I have a positive outlook for Sinner. Don't get it twisted. Why do I have him number 2? Well, 2 things. One, the rule is, historically, unless he's mid-2000s Roger Federer, he's going to take a step back. It is just, for what he did last year, Nadal's never done that 2 years in a row. Djokovic has never done that 2 years in a row. It just normally doesn't happen for a lot of reasons. It's really difficult to maintain that. So there's that part of it. But another part of it is you have to factor in, and it is so close between Sinner and Alcaraz, you have to factor in the possibility of a suspension. That's just reality. CAS is unpredictable. Historically, very favorable to appellants. WADA is an appellant. There was negligence in this case, but it's a complex case where the CAS is going to have to determine whether or not Sinner is liable at all for that negligence. And I don't know how it's going to go. I really don't think it's going to be a hefty suspension, but that's the only opinion I have on it. I don't know if there is going to be, no suspension or a small suspension. However you want to categorize small. I don't know what that even is. Needless to say, Alcaraz doesn't have this potential hazard. And again, boy, it's 1A, 1B. We've seen it in this rivalry. There is very little between the two. That might be the kind of thing, along with, I think, some easier and more obvious improvements that Alcaraz can make, that just decides this for me. So number 1 is Carlos Alcaraz. He keeps saying that last year was a difficult year. He keeps saying that. And that says a lot about a couple things. 1, the bar he sets for himself. And 2, the legitimate mental ups and downs that he went through in a 2024 season that on paper was a success because he won 2 slams. But he was not feeling very good about himself for a long time in the beginning, January, February, maybe a little better with March for the Indian Wells title, injured for a lot of a clay court season that was disappointing for him. And suddenly Roland Garros, Wimbledon, that was great. Olympics, now things get hard again. You can understand why Alcaraz feels like last year was kind of tough. I think this is going to be the year of psychological growth for Carlos Alcaraz. Less dips in matches, more consistent tactical focus, and getting over losses better. When he takes that tough loss, I think at this point it's very clear he needs to do a better job of showing up the next week and getting back to feeling like himself. And this comes with two things. One, a natural maturing process. Two, I'll give a lot of credit to Sinner. When your main rival is Sinner, and that's the guy who you want to beat, and that's the guy who you want to be year-end number one over, well, he is showing the epitome of mental consistency. You better believe that Alcaraz looks at that and says, I gotta try to do that. I gotta be better there. Look, technically, I think the serve is the biggest thing to watch because players have learned the best way to beat Alcaraz is to be ultra aggressive against him. And particularly on the return, don't let him get a first strike in. Just attack him off the jump. And if players are going to use their return as a de facto first strike, well, that can't happen if you're Alcaraz, especially on quick surfaces like grass, right? Like he almost lost to Francis Tiafoe because of this, because Tiafoe was getting the first strike in on return, not letting Alcaraz really produce his offense right away. That's just an example of one match. I can give you a list of 5 or 6. Alcaraz's serve needs to be the first strike. That's the solution to that problem. So I still think the serve technically is the biggest area of improvement to watch. That might be the difference between him overtaking Sinner number 1 next year. Other than that, we know he's got the best forehand when it's on, when it's dialed in. He's got the best net finishing. He's got the best scrambling. He's got a backhand that can bring loads of variety and can deliver damage in a ton of different ways. There's no question about the ceiling of Carlos Alcaraz when he's at his best. There's also no question about the best of 5 factor where he tends to elevate there. So that is that. Carlos Alcaraz at number 1. We'll see how this goes. Coach's mailbag coming up with my childhood coach, Chris Lewitt. Hope you enjoyed this one, everybody. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.